My name is Marin Turner, and I'm the State Director for AARP Kansas. Welcome to our month-long series celebrating the contributions made by African Americans and Black Americans to our great country. Now, at AARP Kansas, we celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion every single day of the year. During Black History Month, we like to shine an extra bright light on the contributions not only of African Americans and Black Americans across the country, but we are focusing on the contributions and the presentations that are going to be made by Kansans. So we know you're going to have a good time. So with that said, sit back, relax, get some popcorn, grab a friend, and have a good time. We're so glad you're here.
Hello, my name is Ann Garvin, and I live in Topeka, Kansas. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about the codes of the quilts used in the Underground Railroad. And I guess my talk would be classified as part of a legend, because since the quilts could not be saved, and if they tried, they're all rotten and gone by now. Also, the fact that the slaves who brought over this idea and did a lot of the quilting were not allowed to learn to read or write. So everything had to be memorized. But since the tribes of the Africans who were brought over were mostly those people who were used to storytelling, because they grew up with griots, and they were also used to their own arts. They used those things together with their normal cunning and paying attention to make this successful. This is a system that communicated to the slaves when they were traveling from the South for freedom in the North. And it was done through the quilts. Now, the quilts were an easy thing to use in the sense that everybody almost made them, and everybody had them. The quilting process was handed down by generations, and it was a common practice to air the quilts. So no one would be suspicious of a quilt hanging out a window. And of course, it would also be a common thing to change the quilts from time to time. Now, the codes worked by being memorized and being used in order. So the symbols were the things that were memorized. And they had one that was called the monkey wrench. And this was the one that said to the slaves, be thinking about all the tools that you will need to make a trip. And the next quilt that was usually hung, because there was an order to the message, was one called the wagon wheel. And that was the one saying, all right, now it's time to pack your stuff for a trip. Take the things that you're going to need on the trip. Think about the food. Think about whatever you're going to need for shelter, some blankets and things like that. And then after that would come one called the bear's paw. And this was the one that said, you are probably going to go through some country where the bears are, wild animals are loose. And what you want to do is look for a bear trail. because this will be the trail that will lead you to places where you can get food and water. Finally, you get to one that was called the bow tie. And it would be the one that would say, if you are a little bit shattered in your clothing, tattered in your clothing, then try to dress a little bit better so that you cannot be identified as not being a free person. And when you know when to do that, you get to one that will say the title is Log Cabin. And that will mean that you are in a safe place, either where there are freed people allowed, or else a safe house, which in some instances would be indicated by having a black spot in the middle of the quilt, the log cabin quilt. Now, you might say, how did they know what path to take? They had a pattern called flying geese. It was made of triangles. And what it did, it was the triangles were situated so that there were points, or the tips of the triangle, that pointed in the direction that the geese would fly. And they would be flying north. So the blocks, the quilted blocks, would usually have 4 sections in them with the double triangles. And one of the sections with the double triangles would be an obviously different color. And that one would be pointed in the direction that you should go, which would be north. They also would have the North Star, of course. And then finally, you get to the one that was the tumbling blocks. And this would say that it's time to stop. Now, there were also stitches that were used. And some of the quilts were made by, instead of stitching, what they called tying. And when they tied the quilts, they took the thread through and they would tie it. They would leave longer strips. But the important thing about the ties were that they could be used to do maps and to indicate distances. So, for instance, if they were making a tie quilt, they would be sure and measure the distance between each of the ties. And the measurement usually stood for a set number. For instance, 5 miles, 10 miles. They usually said that a person would travel no more than 25 miles in one day. That if you were using a measurement of 5 miles, then you would do, for instance, 5 knots 2 inches apart, each one of them. And then when you got to the 5th one, you would make 5 knots in it. So it would be longer. And that would be how you would tell the distances. Most of the slaves probably made the quilts, but there were white people, abolitionists, were black and white, who helped with this, who determined how the maps should go in some cases, and what interpretations. 'Cause there was a symbol called the crossroads. And when you got to the crossroads, it was usually the closest free city or neighborhood. And the quilts that would be hung out for people along the way wouldn't be hung out at all the houses and porches and windows, but you'd have to have abolitionists who would be trusted. Sometimes the quilts might indicate this is a safe house. But the log cabin quilt was used also in that way, that this is a place where you can be sheltered, where you can stop and maybe get some food and a good night's sleep. So you had to know who to trust, and you couldn't be a blabbermouth. The communication in the slave camps worked because, for instance, if they were putting out maybe a drunkard's path to go around a mountain, and they would talk about it. In fact, they had a quilt, I understand, that were called A Trip Around the World. And if the slave owners would overhear them talking about a trip around the world, they would think they were just talking gibberish, because who in the world, what slave's going to be able to take a trip around the world? So that's why they had their own codes. There are codes in the quilts, and there are codes in the talking too, just like the Negro spirituals. You know, the songs that they were singing, the words didn't mean the same thing to everybody. Wade in the water didn't mean to some people what it meant to those people. If you got to be escaping at night or any time, go through the water, because the dogs can't smell your scent when you get in the water. And if you would like more information, I would suggest that you go on the internet and just put in quilt codes of the Underground Railroad. And you will be surprised at the beautiful quilts you'll see and how many of them there were. I hope that you have been entertained. Thank you for listening.